We're going to move on to Dr.Rob Verkerk for the Science and Medical Committee, who have been looking at the interim and preliminary report from a UK laboratory on the COVID vaccine contents that was commissioned by EVMC², the community interest company that does the administration for the World Council for Health. So, Rob Verkerk, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So, Tess provided me with a copy of the report the minute it came through. It's obviously out there. And what we want to do is just provide a little bit of substance around what is going on, because critically, it is an interim report. And as a scientist, I've been involved in quite a few nanotechnological investigations for products ranging from self-assembly natural nanoparticles. Bear in mind that happens every time we interact bile with our food within our bodies. So self-assembly that a lot of people get very disturbed about is a very natural process, and it occurs through electrostatic forces and lipophilic and hydrophilic substances. And we just wanted to get a measure of this. So just a little bit of background. Galileo said all truths are easy to understand once they're discovered. The point is to discover them. Now, the reality is, if you're looking for something that you already know is in a vial, it's a whole lot easier than trying to establish what's in there if you have absolutely no idea. So in many respects, this interim study has come from the perspective that there might be graphene in it. I said to Tess before speaking about it, I wanted to speak with one of the key scientists involved. This morning at a very early hour, Tess and I had a discussion. I continued that discussion for another hour. So I'm confident that the things that we're just going to talk about in summary terms are pretty real. This is basically a concoction of various pieces of data from an article I wrote at the end of last year in December, what's in the jabs that they're so desperate to give us. And it reminds us, because we're going to be looking specifically at the two mRNA jabs and the non-replicating viral vector, the AstroZeneca injection. And you'll see, if you just run across to the middle of the chart, you'll see that in terms of the lipid nanoparticles in the Pfizer and Moderna injections, you're looking at about 10 billion particles per dose for the Pfizer. As you know, there's about 3 times the amount of mRNA in the Moderna, so that's about 40 billion. And when it comes to the adenoviral vectors, it's about 50 billion. So there's a huge amount of supposed active ingredient and carrier within that. On the extreme right, you'll see the other ingredients. And, the prime other ingredients for the mRNA are the pegylated lipid nanoparticles that deliver the products. And then you have polysorbate, sucrose, a bunch of other things within the AstroZeneca slide. That should be all you find in it. There were 3 pieces of data that emerged last year that would suggest, if you are scientifically minded and you care about humanity, you need to take this further. And that was the very reason that Tess decided to commission a study. Pablo Campra's work from Spain was pretty critical. It used Raman spectroscopy that we can very briefly. You'll see another group of scientists that came together that actually included Campra that couldn't disclose who they were. Any leading ISO accredited lab that does that will instantly lose funding, and those scientists will see their careers pretty much terminated. And then you've also got the work we had on WCH Professor Anna Burkhardt just a couple of weeks ago, who is one of the key German pathologists that was able to show some pretty strange objects in pathological examinations that are being carried out that fitted the description of graphene. So this particular unit study is done exclusively with Raman spectroscopy and associated microscopy. Very briefly, what you're doing is shining a laser via a mirror that splits the beam into the spectrometer. You have a detector within it, and from that, you get this scattering. Now, most objects that you strike with this laser, this split laser light, will basically just return the same amount of energy from the photon in the light that's emitted that comes back to it. That's called Rayleigh scattering that you'll see in the 2 other diagrams. But what happens in certain substances, you get a very specific signature for when the substance either absorbs some of that energy or loses some of that energy. So either it creates, basically you're looking at the vibrational state. We've heard a lot about resonance and vibration. As everything on this planet is resonating and vibrating. But what happens depending on the Raman shift, it was called after Raman, because he was an Indian scientist that discovered it, you see this specific scattering, particularly the Stokes direction. That's another scientist that found that that's a more common form. The other form is anti-Stokes, when the molecule that you are subjecting to light absorbs more energy. Has it been studied widely? Absolutely, it has. They're very characteristic bands that you can see in terms of Raman scattering, the D band or the 2D band. There's a reference here that will show you. Graphene is a pretty new substance. It was discovered in 2004. It has very potent electron transport properties. It really lends itself rather beautifully to nano electronic devices. I've been following some of the work that was being done looking at behavioral changes in animals that were being carried out specifically with the purpose of mind control. And that work has been published in major journals. So the people who have suggested there may be a link between 5G or 6G electronic devices and graphene are not barking up a conspiracy theory tree. There is genuine reason to be concerned about the linkage between those two things. It's also fantastically strong substance, 200 times stronger than steel. It can be layered into different layers. Raman spectroscopy is one way of determining those layers. Coming back to the UK, there has been a group in Cambridge headed by Andrea Ferrari that's done a lot of the work in terms of characterizing exactly what graphene is basically very closely related to graphite, but it has this these very specific properties in terms of electron transport and use in nanotechnology. So let's go to the report itself. Essentially, in terms of the supply chain, EBMC squared was able to obtain 4 vials of injection material, 1 Pfizer, 2 Moderna, and 1 AstraZeneca. They came specifically from areas. Many of you will know that the adverse reactions are often clustered in particular geographical locations. And these came from an area of the UK where there had been particular clusters of adverse events. That supply chain, as you will know, because it involves doctors who have to often substitute. We heard from Dr. Hoff about how this works. We've also heard from Dr. Becker in our committee how this happens, that they will, in order to maintain the Hippocratic Oath, sometimes substitute vials for saline in order to do no harm. So that supply chain is known, but again, just like the lab, it cannot be put into the public domain. That, believe it or not, is the scientist calling. And the key here was to establish, first of all, is graphene within or graphite composites within these vials, and actually they were fairly sure that they wouldn't be. So that was an interesting perspective to come from. There isn't a detailed quantitative analysis because it's an early interim study, but there was a vague quantification done by looking at a 2-centimeter transect for all the samples. So you can see there's a little or a lot of these different graphite-related substances in it. So I'm going to take you very quickly. You can obviously get a report and have a more detailed look. Just remember when you look at these images that we're only meant to be seeing, in the case of Moderna, lipid nanoparticles with this very fragile mRNA in it. Now, immediately you start to see things that don't look like that. Should ring the alarm bells. In a normal situation, I've been involved as a scientist in many food adulteration cases. And as soon as you see something like this, normally you can just knock on the door of the national medicines regulator, the MHRA in the UK, and go, look what we found. And they'll pick it up and go after the company. In this case, we all believe that the system is too corrupt to be able to do that. But you'll see just from microscopy, you have a problem. When you start looking at the spectra, now you'll see, for example, on the top left, you'll see that very big peak. That aligns absolutely with the spectrum that you would expect for graphene. But you'll see it's pretty noisy. And it's very noisy because there's a bunch of things in, some of which are fluorescent. So they are reflecting, they're scattering more light. But it's very key that we're seeing that tall peak at exactly the spectrum that is expected for graphene composites. When you go to Pfizer, again, you'll see a whole range of ribbons, filaments, nano dots, all the things that were viewed as some generally conspiracy theories, and they appear to be there. Again, they should not be there. Exactly what they are is defined here by some Raman spectroscopy. There are other ways of doing more detailed characterization, and that's something that I've been talking to the scientists about. Once again, both in terms of counts, you'll see the graphene composites in a 2 centimeter spectrum, and they outnumber everything else. You'll see, again, they have these signature peaks around graphene in them. Same applies to the AstraZeneca as well. So I just want to conclude by saying that it's pretty clear that graphite composite forms as undeclared ingredients are very common in the vials. The Raman spectra were not crystal clear because they were confounded by a lot of noise and fluorescence. What is visible through microscopy appears to be in the form of ribbons, sheets, tubular forms, nano dots, and nano scrolls. And it is our view that further studies should be carried out on more detailed characterization of the forms, more quantification, more studies on function. Why are they there? Obviously, on toxicology. These are all things that are required, even if you're going to be putting natural nanoparticulates into food. Here we have an undeclared, adulterated drug that we can't knock on the door of the regulators with because they're in deep. And you'll see that there were a number of other spectra that were shown up that suggest that other substances that are not declared on the label are also there, including calcite. So these are all minerals. And because it is Valentine's Day, and because I'm working hard to keep to time, I just want to give you one final quote from Lao. This is from 500 years before this guy Jesus roamed the planet, saying, being deeply loved by someone gives you strength, while loving someone deeply gives you courage. And right now, we all need loads of courage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. And I think suffice to say, I don't think we need to take questions on it, but just to suffice to say that there needs to be more investigation into this, if only because there are undeclared items in these vaccine vials. We will keep you abreast of developments with that as analyses are ongoing.